Thank you for the amazing introduction, and yeah, thank you for all the previous speakers so far. Some great sessions already. Um, so I'm sure it's been a long week for everybody, and especially a long day. So I'm really happy to see that we've got lots of people still dialing in at this late time, especially in Saudi Arabia. So yeah, I'll try and do my best to make this session as valuable as I can for you. So I hope you learn one or two things today. Um, so today I'm going to be talking to you about how to basically secure and govern intelligent Power Platform solutions. So let's get started. So I'm going to show you a picture and let me know if anyone recognizes this picture. So it's a screenshot that I found. If you don't recognize it, it's probably not a bad thing because you're probably not as old as I am now. So this is a picture of Microsoft Dynamics CRM 1.2 or 1.0. So it was released like in the early 2000s, and you can see it's still got like the similar functionality to what we can see today in terms of contacts, leads, and all this kind of stuff that you already know about. So this is kind of how the Microsoft Power Platform and business applications has started. And if we look like 20 years onwards, this is a screenshot that I've taken a few days ago from a Dataverse environment of a model-driven app. And you can see like the things are pretty much still the same. I mean, the UI has evolved a lot, but the SQL database is still there. It still forms over data. There's still business logic. There's still the same capability to customize it using JavaScript. Obviously, it's got a lot of new features. It's been kind of maybe a bit faster to develop, but I think the fundamental concepts were still the same. So what happened in November 2022? So Chat GPT was released, and with that came obviously large language models. And there was a fundamental shift in the industry in the way that we interact with systems. So as you can see from the previous screen, we were primarily interacting with forms and UI, whereas with the introduction of the large language models, we can now have a conversation with systems. So before I get into the details of the content, so a quick introduction to me in case you not seen me before. So I'm Wael Hamzi. I'm a Power Platform lead, Microsoft Business Applications MVP. So I've been working for over 20 years, with Microsoft technologies. If you would like to connect with me, here are some of the channels where I publish some content when I get time. So it would be really great, to kind of have a chat with you offline if you've got any questions after this session. All right. So today I'm going to be talking obviously around security and governance. So I'm going to try and address it more from an AI perspective. I think everything I talk about will still cover some of the kind of fundamentals around governing Power Platform and Dynamics, but I'm going to look at it from an AI lens perspective. So with the introduction to AI, and especially in the Power Platform space, a number of things have changed. So this is a summary in terms of some of the things that have changed. So first of all, as I mentioned, from a behavior and interaction, so instead of talking to screens and clicking buttons, we can now have a chat with the systems. In terms of permissions, I mean, in the old days, like, if you create a Canvas app on top of, a Dataverse, if the Canvas app shows you one screen, you just see whatever is on that screen, even though you may have access to hundreds of tables. Whereas, if you put an agent on top of Dataverse, it will try and use all of these 100 tables if it can. So I think that there is a difference in terms of depth of permissions, in terms of how we access data. With the old days, as you've seen in the previous presentation, Power Automate, is a fairly deterministic process. So you can tell it exactly what you want, and it will always do what you tell it to do. Whereas when we move to kind of copilots and agents, it becomes a bit more probabilistic in terms of, you don't always get the same outcome with the same input. There's also the autonomy as well. So like with an app, you click a button and you know exactly what you're asking it to do. Whereas when it comes to copilots and agents and trying to understand what you're trying to do, and sometimes it will make a decision, based on your own thing as well. And then you've got the visibility. So you click a few buttons, things get saved in Dataverse. So it's very easy to see what's going on. But when you're having a chat, a lot of things can happen in that chat. A lot of the things the agent can decide to do on its own. So visibility becomes a problem as well. And also kind of governance changes as well. So instead of controlling like what apps we built, then things become like, what's the impact of AI on things like that. So I guess when we're trying to think about how we manage this platform going forward, we have to take all of these things into consideration. We can't kind of have the same ways of thinking the way we used to do when we were building normal solutions. So AI is becoming more capable, as you can see as well. So it can understand loads of data more than a person could ever understand. It can, make decisions, and it can also take actions on that data. So day by day is becoming more capable in what it can do. So the idea is to get, the value in terms of how it can help us, with our daily lives and, managing companies and things like that. But also AI has a few limitations. So this is an example. So for example, I asked AI, I want to wash my car. The car wash is 100 meters away. Should I walk? Should I drive? And it asked me to walk. So, with all this processing power and data behind the scenes, and it can't, in some cases, make a very, simple decision like that. So I think when we want to kind of manage and govern AI, we have to kind of understand limitations as well. Because limitations can have kind of severe side effects in some cases, especially when you put this technology for kind of very serious processes. So just keep that in mind as we kind of try and use and adopt this technology. All right. So before I kind of cover details into how we secure and govern Power Platform, I'm just gonna briefly talk to you about what is Power Platform and what AI capabilities we have within Power Platform. So Power Platform, typically you got the 4 pillars, which is apps, automate, pages, and Copilot Studio or kind of chatbots. And then you got Dataverse and connectors. So this is, Power Platform as we know it. And then on top of that, we got Dynamics 365. So this is kind of first-party applications, whether that's sale, customer service, and all these kind of things. If you can make out what each icon means, that would be very impressive. So when it comes to AI, these are some of the AI capabilities that we need to worry about when it comes to security and governance. So first of all, we've got the Dynamics 365 Copilot. So these are coming out of the box from Microsoft. So for example, in sales, it can summarize your opportunities. It can help you draft emails and things like that. And then we got the agents, which are, again, out of the box agents that come, as part of these products. So as an example, in customer service, for example, it can, look at your previous cases, and it can decide, what updates you need to make to your knowledge base to be able to cover, some of the things or some of the gaps that you've got in your knowledge. So this is kind of first-party applications. When we look at Power Platform, we got something like the Maker Copilot. So, traditionally we used to build, applications using drag and drop or, using Visual Studio. So now you can just type in natural language and, it can build, it can understand your requirements and build things for you. We also got custom agents in the sense of Copilot Studio. So not only you can build custom agents and copilots, but you can also extend the Dynamics agents and copilots and the Microsoft 365 agents and copilots. We got also the in-app assistance, so things like, as an example, you want to auto, form fill assistant where it can automatically fill forms for you or row summaries. So these are all the different capabilities that you can plug into, Power Apps, or you can surface, within the user interfaces that you have. And finally, we got AI Builder. So this is where you can do kind of traditional machine learning, or you can, use large language models to, do different tasks like summarization, sentiment analysis, and things like that. So as you can see, there's lots of capabilities in the platform, and they're not going to be less capabilities. It's only going to grow by day, and they're changing very rapidly. So, managing and governing all of that stuff, becomes a headache, and, you can sometimes be overwhelmed with the amount of things that are kind of pushed down, on a weekly basis. So even though I'm talking about AI, when we talk about governance and security, some of the traditional things still apply. So things like making sure that you've got the right permissions, making sure that you don't overshare apps or flows or agents too broadly. The worries around data being exfiltrated outside of the organization. So things like, DLP management. You got, improper control over environments. How many environments do you have? What do you do? What, where? Not being able to deploy things in a consistent way to production. How do you monitor your apps, flows, and agents? So, all of these challenges are still there when it comes to AI, but, it's more like they get amplified. So some of these things. So I think whatever practices that we use today to manage all of these different challenges are still valid, but I think we've got a few more things to worry about, which I will be, walking you throughout this session today. So briefly, in terms of AI related threats, so these are the new things that we need to worry about, when it comes to AI, and they are in different categories. So I'll kind of pick up a few in each category. So when it comes to security, if somebody's got more permissions that they need, it becomes a much bigger problem with AI because the agent can, reason over large amounts of data. So users wouldn't probably be able to go and analyze all the different records and database, but the agent can do that. You got things like agents being able to do things that they shouldn't be able to do. So again, limiting what they can do becomes, a much bigger problem. You got things also from an operational perspective. So the models, you don't necessarily give you the same answer every time you ask the same question. So how do you, manage that behavior? How do you make sure that you're getting the right output? How do you manage the behavior drift over time as well as models get upgraded and, the answers have become different? Also from a compliance perspective, like, previously you've got your source code and it told you exactly what the source code is going to do or the system is going to do. So from a compliance perspective, like how do you explain to a regulator, for example, when something happens that wasn't expected? So that also becomes, a different challenge. So how do you kind of are able to prove that certain things happen because of certain configurations or actions? And also from a governance perspective, I think one of the kind of governance things is like, how do you, make sure that you've got AI in the right places, you're using AI in the right ways, and the right people got access to the right capabilities. So these are some of the things that I'm going to try and tackle in the session today. And some of these topics probably deserve a session on their own. But today I'm just going to give a high-level overview just to give you kind of some guidance in terms of the way of thinking and some of the features in the platform that can help. And hopefully we'll do more sessions in the future where we can dive deeper into some of these topics. So how do we govern in the age of AI? So, traditional AI governance, we were basically governing logic. So, controlling what solutions get built, controlling what was being built, is the app safe? Does it go to the right data sources and things like that? So the shift is when we go to kind of govern intelligent systems is like we're governing more like a decision maker, because these systems can make decisions on their own, obviously with input from us. So our governance moves into kind of, instead of controlling what we're building, it kind of moves into controlling the behavior. And, we need to ask ourselves a question, I guess, what could go wrong if the user, types in a question in the prompt that we weren't expected? And that's what we should be looking to govern, basically trying to, look at this scenario and trying to make sure that things are safe and secure. So as I mentioned, so we're moving from, controlling what was built to controlling, what can happen, basically. So there is different ways to look at adoption of AI, and I think different organizations might look at it differently, and different teams may have different kind of risk appetite and things like that. But I think sometimes the initial approach is basically restriction. So basically disable the AI features, block the usage, and it basically slow down everything. And it's becoming more difficult to do that as well, because some of these features are becoming enabled out of the box. So instead of trying to restrict things, I guess we should move towards enablement, which is basically instead of disabling, how do we make it safe? Instead of blocking usage, how do we shape the usage so it's done in the right way? And that allows us to obviously to move things faster, by adopting AI and, some of these new technologies. So basically, instead of, blocking things, we should ask, how do we get people to use AI safely by default? And, how do we, maximize innovation and remove the fear of, things going wrong? So, who is responsible basically for, doing all of that and making sure that, we are doing things in the right way? So I think the short answer is it's a lot of people and a lot of teams. And so if we think of AI as something in the center, then the first responsibility is basically on the makers, and they tend to shape intent because they're the people that are building the stuff. So their role is to kind of define how the AI is going to behave by configuring the agents and the copilots. And then we got the admins, which is basically putting the boundaries around the environments and the makers, and they're deciding how far this capability can be used, what features this capability can be used. So it's quite important as well. So think of them as like, if makers are the first line, then the admins are like the second line. And I think architects fall in a similar group. They're kind of in between the makers and the admins. So they're more or less like defining the architecture and deciding, what data points can be used, where they can be used and things like that. And then we got like the compliance, which is the third line of defense, which is like, so these are there to provide accountability. So once all of these other things are working, how do we detect if things go wrong? How do we investigate it? What data we use to investigate? And also, how do we, prove, what happens, and how do we, recover from things? So, so in terms of governance implementation, I guess, I've spoken about makers. So makers are managing prompts, the topics, the actions. The architects are looking at the data model, the dataverse security in particular, and managing the knowledge sources. The admins are looking at things like tenant settings, environment groups, DLP, and the compliance. Basically, they're looking at making sure that we've got the audit logs, making sure the audit logs are monitored, and making sure we are able to identify things from the audit logs and the monitoring and be able to take the right actions on it. So with these four layers, we should be able to basically be able to govern the platform in a better way. So in terms of shaping AI adoption, so there's a number of questions that we need to ask ourselves. So one of them is, which AI is appropriate? So which AI products and features are appropriate for what use cases? Then we have to decide, where do we use AI? Which environments can use AI? Which environments make sense to use AI and what projects? And then we need to decide which users do we want to give access to AI? Like, is it the pro developers only? Is it citizen developers? Is it end users? And then finally, we want to decide, when should we enable AI? And there is a number of decisions that can play in there. So for example, maybe you need to do some reviews, maybe you need to get some approvals. So these are kind of any dependent activities that you need to do, but also in what order do you want to enable? Like, do you want to go, all the capabilities in one go? Do you want to enable one by one? So again, these are the different things that, you need to consider when you're trying to decide, how do you, do AI adoption, safely and securely. So one of the kind of concepts that can help with that is a Gartner concept that you've probably seen in a number of presentations. And this is a slight variation of it. But basically, we got this wide spectrum. So we got a little green area down the bottom left, and then it becomes a bit orange, and then it becomes a bit red. And the idea is that when we're building solutions, there is a risk with every solution that we build. So the idea is, solutions move, between low and high risks. So on the green side, basically, the low risk solutions, and the other kind of way of looking at it is scale as well. So we're moving on a scale from a person to the whole organization. So, a flow used by one person, that reminds them to, I don't know, send their, timesheet or book their task or meeting or something is a much lower risk and a much lower scale than an application that gets used, by hundreds of people and manages customer data, for example. So that's why I think we can use this metric to define zones. So we start with the green zone. So this is like the personal productivity. So this is where individuals or small teams can build stuff. You can use it to learn the technologies, mostly non-production, and you can use it to try some of the new innovations. So in there, it's mostly non-production data, and the risk is fairly low. And then we move into the amber zone. So we're kind of moving into the medium risk area. So it's typically for like small departments or the slightly medium departments. And sometimes these can include kind of citizen developers. And from an AI perspective, we're probably typically looking here at human-assisted AI. So this is where the human is in the loop. And then we move into the red zone, which is like proper IT projects and then enterprise applications. And then this is the zone where you could put in autonomous agents where they kind of automate things end to end. But again, the reason why I did like this spectrum because it's not black and white. Sometimes you may get use cases that are on the border. So it all depends on how your organization operates, but it is a good model to bear in mind. So you can decide how to shape things going forward. So before we move on, just a few patterns, when we're deciding, AI solutions. So in terms of identity, I think we used to think as things in the terms of systems and people. So we got the users and then we got the systems. So when it comes to AI, I think things remain still the same but slightly different. So we got the co-pilots, which basically they're acting mostly on behalf of the users. So their identity is delegated. So we want to make sure that if a co-pilot does something, then it does something on behalf of the user. It means it doesn't give user additional permissions than they already have. And then when it comes to agents, basically, we need to think about agents as, as an additional person in the team. And we need to apply to them, if not the same, even more security, permissions than an individual person will have. And then obviously the last thing when it comes to identity is, we need to make sure that we abide by the least privilege principles and we have a robust, role-based access controls. And when it comes to data, there is two things that we need to bear in mind. So one of them is, we need to make sure that we, select the right knowledge sources for the agents. And we need to think about context. So the fact that the agent has access to two knowledge sources or to two individual knowledge sources may be fine. But if you combine these two knowledge sources, we may get some outcomes that we don't want. So again, think about the full end-to-end picture. And then when it comes to actions, again, we need to try and limit the actions, decide whether we want the human in the loop. And then we sometimes can decide when we want the human in the loop as well. Do we want the human in the loop only for high risk activities, but maybe we can automate some of the things? So again, these are some of the patterns that you can think about when you kind of try and design your copilots and agents. All right. So I'm going to jump now into kind of talking about some of the Power Platform features that can help us with some of the problems and threats that I've discussed. And then we're going to try after that and bring it all together in terms of how do these impact, the way you think about, copilots and agents. So the first one is tenant settings. So this is the top level settings in your organization. So this is where you can, define one setting and it basically applies across the whole tenant. Below that, we typically have something called the environment groups. So this is where you can group environments into a certain group, and then you can apply settings at a group level. And then below that, we got managed environments. So similar to environment groups, but you can only apply that setting at one single environment at a time. And then, so these are the settings that are typically done by the tenant admins. So it means, this is the platform owners that, decide, certain how things should operate across the organization. And then we got, people at the project level who can decide what settings they want for individual environments, but also what settings they want for very specific features. And these are typically controlled by the environment admins and the makers. So in terms of what things we're trying to control, or before that, so one thing to mention, I guess, is, if we set something at the tenant level, then we make sure that that setting is consistent all the way down. And if we set something, for example, at environment settings level, we can always override it. If we got the same setting at managed environments, that will override the setting at environment settings. And, the same goes for these layers. It's also important to mention that not all settings are available at all the layers. So, for example, you can, turn off feedback at this level, but you may not be able to turn it off or turn it on at this level. So I think you need to think about exactly which setting you're working with and where you should set it. So in terms of what we're trying to control with these settings, we're trying to control governance, we're trying to control security, and we're trying to control behavior. And these are the three important factors that are not only important for agents, but in general, everything that we do with the Power Platform. So let's start with tenant settings. So this is quite important because it allows us to control some of the different AI behaviors. So if you go into your admin center, go to tenant settings, you can search for AI or copilots, or you can just look at all of them. But basically, you can see, it allows you to, for example, control whether you want to use some of the preview features in your tenant, which can be quite important because sometimes these features are not mature and it can cause problems if you use them in production. So and some of the things in tenant settings you can't see in the UI. So if you run a PowerShell script, you can get the list of all the tenant settings in there, and then you can use the same script to basically update the tenant settings. So that gives you access to some of the features that you may not have on the UI. But just be mindful, look at the documentation because some of these features may not support it, and the behavior may change over time. So why do we use tenant settings? So we can control who can create environments, we can control preview features, we can decide whether we want to use generative AI in Copilot Studio or we're just going to use traditional chatbots. We can disable maker copilots if we want, if we're not ready for them. We can control who can build agents by using security groups and things like that. We can configure environment routing. So, instead of landing in a default environment, which most of us don't want, you can send people to a developer environment. You can control certain security features and, loads of other things. So, make sure you're familiar with the tenant settings, and they change, very frequently. So, you probably something you want to stay on top of, especially if you're kind of managing a large environment. So the next one is environment groups. So under the tenant, we can have an environment group or more than one environment group, and each environment group can have more than one environment. And it's important to note that an environment can only belong to one environment group, so you can't have like settings coming from two different groups. But the most important thing is that an environment group will have one or more rules, and these are the rules that then you can use to control different behaviors, whether that's enabling AI products, configuring how they behave, or controlling some of the security features that are relevant to the platform. So going back, to how we should set up environment groups. So we can think about it the same way as we looked at the previous zones. So we could have an environment group for the green zone. So for example, personal productivity. Where we can put the default environment and restrict connectors and things like that in there, restrict sharing other bits and pieces. We can have learning and innovation as well, where we can add developer environments in there and configure the settings that we want in there, allow the features that we want and stop the features that we don't want to allow. Then we can have like the orange zone where we can have sandbox and production environments, and we can have different settings for these. And when it comes to the red zone, I certainly like to split things between production and non-production. So I would have an environment group for non-production where I kind of apply all the settings to developer and sandbox environments. Sometimes you may want to have different groups for development and testing because you may want to allow unmanaged solutions in dev but not in test. So you can control that using environment groups, and you would have a different environment group for production, and then you would have probably different DLP settings, different URLs. Potentially disabling all preview features and things like that. So this is just one way to look at it. There is no right or wrong way. It's basically what makes sense for your organization. But I find it useful just to kind of things in terms of these different zones. And I think the difficult part would be basically trying to decide, to decide what features goes in what zone. So I'm quickly gonna just go quickly through some of these things, just conscious of time. So another feature that we have in the platform is data policy. So this allows us to control what connectors our apps, flows, and agents can use. So this is the traditional data policies. One of the good things about data policies is you can control actions. So that is quite important for agents. So for example, if you want to use the X connector, you may decide you can read information from X, but you don't allow the agent to, publish or retweet stuff. And you can also block any future actions. And it also allows you to configure the HTTP URLs. So for example, if you use the HTTP connector, you can only allow internal URLs or specific URLs, which is quite useful. And then, you can control obviously custom connectors. And, that is quite important if you use a lot of custom connectors. So yeah, keep DLP policies in mind. I'll come back to it later. The other thing is tenant isolation. So if you've allowed the SharePoint connector, for example, can you access a SharePoint in a different tenant? That becomes quite important. I mean, a user may not know or necessarily go into another tenant, but if an agent's got access to multiple tenants, it will certainly, try to use that connection if possible. So it's important to lock this down if you are not using it. And then there is also another new feature in the platform, which is called advanced connector policies. So this is probably the way things are gonna, move going forward. So the important things to mention is it's currently in preview. It can be added as a rule to environment groups. So if you've got an environment group for the green zone, you can add a connector policy in there. And what it basically allows you to do is basically decide what connectors you want to use in there. But the difference between this and the DLP policy is in this one, you can block all the connectors if needed, whereas in the DLP, 24 connectors you can't block. So it can be a bit problematic if you're working with agents, because the idea is to kind of restrict what they can do as much as possible. So I think we've been asking, obviously, Microsoft for quite a long time to block all the connectors, but I think now that we have agents, I think this is becoming a lot more important. So hence why we have advanced connector policies. And then you can obviously decide what actions to allow as well. So this is just an idea. You have obviously less connectors in here, so you don't have some of the Power Automate desktop connectors. You don't have some of the Copilot Studio connectors in here, so just be mindful of that. But you can, block the actions from here for all the connectors. Another feature that I wanted to briefly talk about is subnet delegation. So you can put your Power Apps and Power Automate and your agents in a subnet in Azure, which basically means any connectors and plugins that are of that subnet can use all your proxy and network infrastructure to go out to the internet. So basically you get full control over what goes out of your environment, which can be quite useful if you want to restrict things further. And then just briefly, some of the security features as well. So I'll just quickly go over these. So we've spoken about some of these things already at the tenant level. We've spoken about the connectors in terms of how we can manage things. And then we've got the environment settings. So we can configure settings at the environment. We can configure settings at the apps and Dataverse. I think the key takeaway from this slide is, we got, security at different levels. So, you got different controls to decide whether you are a user, whether you can access the tenant. Then you got, different roles to decide whether you can get into the environment. Once you get into the environment, you got your database security to decide what you can't do, what you can't do, what you can and what you can't do. And then you can decide, which apps and flows you can access and at what level. So lots of layers to go through. Make sure you use them, to kind of get the right security model. And then environment settings. I've mentioned environment groups, but environment settings gives you a lot more access because not all the rules are there in environment groups. So make sure you kind of, if you got a setting that you can't find in environment groups, there is probably a setting at the environment level you can, utilize to do that. All right. Just quickly on Dataverse security. So when you're working with agents and apps, it's important that they get access to the different levels of data. So make sure you use all the features that you got from Database security in terms of restricting tables, rows, columns, and things like that to make sure that use the least privilege principle when you're kind of configuring the security on Dataverse. All right, I'm going to move quickly into this topic because I think this is probably the most important topic of this call. So how do we control our agents' behavior using all these settings? So I'm going to use this analogy today. So think of your Copilot Studio agent as an agent, like as a person. So it's got its feet, which is basically, you need to make sure that it's standing in the right place, which means it's, utilizing the right knowledge sources. Then it got its hands, which are the tools that it can use. So make sure that it's got the right tools for the job. And then it got its mouth, which is basically, where can it communicate? So these are the channels. And then the head is basically how it thinks and, orchestrates all of these things. So I think if you want to kind of build a safe and secure agent, you want to make sure that basically, you've got control and oversight over all of these different things. And I'm going to tell you exactly in the next slide how to do, all of these things. So in terms of grounding the agent, making sure it's standing in the right place. So you can use DLP to control knowledge sources. So some of the knowledge sources are, connectors in the DLP. So you can, for example, allow access to public websites using DLP, or you can block access if you don't want, regardless of whether the person goes obviously and configures things in the agent. On top of that, obviously make sure you only select the required knowledge sources for the agent. And within the knowledge source, make sure you only select the required artifacts. So if you're connecting to Dataverse and you only need 2 tables, just select these 2 tables. Don't give access to the agents to all the tables. Keep the inference risk in mind. So, make sure that you understand the impact of giving agent access to multiple data sources and how the risk can increase as a result of that. If you've got agents, or if you're trying to build agents for multiple purposes, try and maybe split the agents. So this is at a high level, how do you make sure that the agent's got the right knowledge sources and it's got the only knowledge sources that it needs? And then we move into kind of controlling, what can the agent do? So again, you can use a combination of DLP and advanced connector policies to control the tools. You can limit the connectors, limit the action, and limit the endpoints as required. Only select the required tools in the agents, obviously, for what you're trying to build. Don't add things just in case you need them. And provide the agent with the minimum access to the target system. So for example, if you're connecting to Dataverse, give the agent the minimum security level or role that it needs. And then, with tools, sometimes a tool can have, severe impact. So consider whether you want to tell the agents whether you want the human in the loop before it does something. So that is quite important. And then obviously consider multiple agents as well. So the next one is, how do we control, where the agent can speak? So these are the channels. So again, you can use DLP to control some of the channels. So some of these channels, if you search in DLP, like Copilot Studio or channels, you can see some of them you can block in there. You can also restrict channels using environment groups. So sounds like you can do something in multiple places. So, you need to decide where you want to do that. And only publish, obviously, agents to the channels that you need. You can add more channels later. Use the appropriate authentication for each channel. If you need anonymous authentication, think about whether you really need it or whether you can use an authenticated authentication mechanism. And finally, consider whether you want to limit the usage of the agents, especially in some of the lower productivity environments. Do you want to allow 5 people to use the agent? Do you want to allow 100,000? Decide, what's the right level for sharing the agent across the different environments. And finally, the most important thing in the agent is the brain. So this is basically the large language models. So first things to decide, what orchestration you want to use in there. Do you want to use kind of typical chatbot, or do you want to use generative AI orchestration? All the different good prompt engineering practices apply here. So make sure you tell agent everything, be as specific as you can, tell it what its role is, what's the scope, what you don't want it to do, when do you want it to escalate things to you. decide on whether you want it just to advise or whether you want it to take action, be explicit about that, and then decide what model you want to use and whether you want to add a configuration to that model. So again, that becomes quite important as well. So so that is basically an overview of how you can basically control your agents. So just a few things before we wrap up. So once you deploy your agent, your job is not done. Basically, you want to know what these agents are doing. You want to know, you want to be able to explain why they did things the way they did, and also you want to be able to take action once you find certain insights from there. So there are a number of things to kind of do here. So I'll just give you a list of tools basically. So you can use the agent inventory in the admin center to know what agents you got on a tenant. You can use the Power Platform activity logs to see the different actions in terms of who's building agents, what they're doing. You can use the Dataverse auditing to see what agents are doing in Dataverse. You can use the conversation transcripts to understand what conversations happen and potentially investigate why they happened. And also you can use the analytics to understand, which agents are being used, which ones are not used, how they're being used, and all this kind of stuff. And then you can use application insights integration as well to gain advanced insights into your agents in terms of, what they're doing, how they're doing, things are failing, so they're not failing, all these kind of things. You get a lot of information in there. And you can consider prompt versioning as well to make sure that you can, understand what prompt was used at what point in time for a specific decision, because obviously your prompts may evolve over time. And finally, you can install the Copilot Studio Kit, which gives you a lot of additional things that are not available in the product today. I won't go into too much detail. Probably we can do a session on that. And finally, if you detect things, what you can do if you don't like the behavior, worst case scenario, disable the agents until you fix it. Sometimes you just disable a channel. You can obviously adjust the prompts to make it better, and you can restrict the tools and, update your knowledge sources. So these are the typical things you can do to kind of improve the agent. So I guess almost on time. So just a few key takeaways from this session before I wrap up. So one of the first things is the SafeNet agent is the one that was never allowed to be built, which basically means, in other words, if you're not ready to build agents, make sure you're ready before you start building agents, and make sure that if you allow somebody to build agents, they understand what they're doing. And some of the zoning strategies can also obviously help with that I discussed earlier. The other one is a safe agent is safe when it stands in the right place, which means it's got the right knowledge sources. It knows the right things, which means it knows the right things, which we're talking about, the knowledge sources, and then it does the right actions, which means you give it the right tools, and then it's got the right channels. The other thing is we can use security to control what the agent can do, but we need to use the prompts and other things to control what the agent decides to do during the execution based on context and other things. The other things is AI still has limitations, so we don't use it or trust it before because it's doesn't have any of these, but we use it because we want to basically understand it, know how to use it, observe it, and control it well. So the typical cycle would be deploy something, see how it works, learn from that, and then adjust and keep evolving over that. And then basically to summarize it all up, I guess, decide where you want to allow using AI. And then once you do that, deciding what the controls are in there so you can manage, behavior, and you can, keep control of it over time. I've spoken for quite a lot of time. I'm not sure whether we got time for Q&A, but hopefully you found it useful.
الفيديو ده برعاية رشيد. مع رشيد إحنا معاك طول الطريق وهنبسطها لك من غير تعقيد. اعمل سكان للQR كود ده أو ادخل على rashid.pro وهتلاقي كل الجديد.